Hi, welcome everybody. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick. Thank you so much for tuning in again tonight. And to our first-time viewers, thanks for being with us. I hope that for those of you who celebrate Passover, your Seders were meaningful and that you are continuing to celebrate this wonderful festival of freedom, springtime and redemption, Moadim L'Simcha. And to those who will celebrate Easter and Ramadan, we wish you a wonderful holiday experience. Tonight is our 49th program, meaning that for 49 consecutive weeks, we have welcomed you to this America at a Crossroads series, virtual town hall series. Tonight, we are looking forward to a lively and important conversation about the importance of truth and facts to the preservation of our democracy. We welcome Jennifer Kavanagh, Jennifer Rubin, and Warren Olney. And in a moment, my partner, David Lehrer, will introduce our panelists. This series was envisioned and has been implemented as a joint venture between Jews United for Democracy and Justice and Community Advocates, Inc. Our leadership team members are Zev Yaroslavsky, Mel Levine, Rabbi Ken Chazen, Caroline Kelly, David Lehrer, and myself. Thank you to our many wonderful co-sponsors whose names were posted before the program. And tonight we especially welcome C-SPAN and all C-SPAN viewers who will be covering tonight's program. We have some amazing programs coming up. Next week, we will welcome the legendary historian Doris Kearns Goodwin. That program is on Tuesday, not Wednesday, so be sure you mark your calendars correctly. It's April 6th at 5 p.m. LA time. And the following week is also on Tuesday when we will welcome Fareed Zakaria, also on a Tuesday night at 5 p.m. Los Angeles time. This week, we added a program to explore the issue of anti-Asian racism with Congressmember Judy Chu and prominent Asian American advocate and lawyer Stuart Quo. That's on April 28th. And I request that you register early. If you register right before a program, you might not get the link on time. So it's best to register at least no later than the day before the program. Thank you for your continued donations and attendance. We will continue this series as long as you continue to support our efforts. Because so many of you ask, recordings of all 48 of our past programs are accessible on our website, JewsUnitedForDemocracy.org. And each email I send has a link to all past programs in it. Now to introduce our guest for tonight, let me hand you off to the one and only David Lehrer.
Thank you, Janice. I'm pleased to join and welcome you to America at a Crossroads. If it's Wednesday night, it must be time for another of our virtual town halls. Tonight, we feature one of our most frequent guests, Washington Post columnist Jennifer Rubin. She's been an off-sided pundit with the Post since 2010. She's also a contributor to MSNBC News. She has, by virtue of her columns and 3 times daily blogs, been described as a phenomenon and one of the most prolific online political writers, and I might add, one of the most thoughtful. She was the guest on our very first program in April of last year, also moderated by tonight's host, Warren Olney. Jennifer Kavanagh is the director of the Strategy, Doctrine, and Resources program of the RAND Corporation, one of the largest and most influential think tanks in the world. 32 Nobel laureates have been associated with RAND. Jennifer leads the Countering Truth Decay initiative. Part of her research focuses on disinformation and the relationship between American political and media institutions. Our host is a good friend and our most frequent moderator, Warren Olney. His resume includes decades of programs at KCRW and now the To the Point and To the Point Climate Change Update podcasts. He is a respected voice of reason in today's troubled media world. In the interest of full disclosure, Warren received an honorary doctorate in public policy from the Rand Hardee Graduate School in 2016. Warren?
David, thank you so very much. And thank you in the audience very much for being with us as well. You will not be forgotten. When you send your questions in to David, he will ultimately, I think in about 35 or 40 minutes, text them to me, and we'll get our guest to answer as many as you can. But I want to thank America at the Crossroads for giving me the opportunity to talk to 2 such very distinguished and accomplished Jennifers. I have to tell you that my own daughter, my oldest daughter, is named Jennifer. So I won't forget what to call you as the program goes on. And I'm delighted to be here with both of you. So let me start, since we're talking about truth decay, let me start with a book, which is called Truth Decay. This was published by the RAND Corporation in 2018. Jennifer Kavanagh is one of the authors of that book. And Jennifer, let me put the first question to you. You said at the outset in the introduction that you wanted to find a clear definition of truth decay. You listed some trends and in other ways described what you had in mind. But let me ask you, how would you define truth decay as you're studying it now at the Rand Corporation?
Well, thanks for that question. We define truth decay as the diminishing role that facts, data, and analysis increasingly play in our political and civil discourse and in the policymaking process. And as you mentioned, we used 4 trends to bring that definition to life. The first is an increasing disagreement about facts and data. An example would be the disagreement about the safety of vaccines. As we get more and more data that vaccines are safe, we see an increasing number of people that believe that they're not. And that was true before COVID-19 was even something that was on our radar. The second trend and the third trend go together, a blurring of the line between fact and opinion, and an increasing relative volume of opinion compared to fact. You can see examples of this on social media or cable news, anywhere where facts and opinion are presented in an interchangeable way that makes it really difficult for the average reader or viewer to disentangle what's a fact and what's not. And the final trend is a declining trust in key institutions that we used to look to as sources of objective factual information, places like the media and the government. So we end up in a situation in which people are not only not sure what's a fact and what's not, but they're not even sure where to turn to find that factual information. So that's the general characterization of this phenomena that we call truth decay at Rand and that we've been studying for about 5 years now.
Thank you, Jennifer Kavanagh. Jennifer Rubin, let me get to you right away and ask you this. You wrote a column today, which is about the Jim Crow style legislation cropping up in legislatures around the country. Jim Crow, the term that you use, to describe legislation that appears to be designed to prevent people of color from being able to cast their votes. Do you see it or the arguments for it, this legislation, as an example of truth decay or the consequence of truth decay?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's always nice to see you, Warren. I think the basis for this legislation is precisely what Jennifer Kavanagh was describing. The justification for all of these measures is that we had some incidents of fraud or confusion or irregularities during the 2020 election, and therefore we have to cure it by making it, quite frankly, very hard to vote. We know factually that is false. We had some 60 lawsuits. We had states that did multiple audits. Georgia, which just passed one of these bills, did 3 of them and found no evidence of any kind of significant fraud. And in fact, I believe the statistic is in Georgia that since about 2008, there have been 8 instances of fraud which have been detected and which have been prosecuted. So the entire premise behind this is I think, a sad and precise example of what has happened. Rather than debating how do we make voting easier, how do we make voting more reliable, the premise on which this I think surge of legislation is based is just factually wrong. And so it's very difficult to have a conversation then with people who are behind this if their premise is, well, we have to fix it because there was all this fraud. And that's the dilemma in a fact-decayed political environment. You can't debate on the issues because you can't even agree on the facts.
So Jennifer Kavanagh, back again to your book, Truth Decay, you list causes of truth decay in the book. What cause would you find for what we just heard described by Jennifer Rubin?
Well, so I think that the phenomenon of truth decay and the example that Jennifer Rubin gave have a number of causes. And I think the first is just that over several decades, our society has become really comfortable with peddling in misinformation. Misinformation is so prevalent and so spread so quickly and so widely that it's not a stretch to have false narratives and conspiracy theories emerge and then spread like wildfire around a whole range of different issues. And that's fueled, I would say, by a couple of things. I would point to two kind of key drivers. The first is our information environment. Our information environment is very diverse. We have tons of different sources. The online space is filled with different types of information and easily accessible information. That's a good thing in the sense that a democratized information environment allows for more voices to have a platform. It makes it easy for us to find information. We're not reliant on one person to filter information down to us. But it also means that we don't have the same kinds of quality filters or the same kinds of indicators that we might have had several decades ago, which makes it difficult then to distinguish between high quality and low quality information. And at the same time, there's so much information that it can just be an overwhelming task for the average person to sift through it and to figure out what to focus on and what to discard. And so that this environment then allows false narratives to really spread like wildfire and to spread really far. And so that gives these narratives around election integrity, as well as a whole host of other issues, a lot of power and a lot of amplification. And then the second factor that I would point to is the polarization and sort of the political and social climate in which we live. When we talk about polarization in the context of truth decay, we're not just talking about political polarization, but about social and demographic polarization and the extent to which these different types of cleavages are really reinforcing, so that we end up in communities that are pretty insular and surrounded by people who are like us. This type of environment then gives additional foundation, additional grounds for these alternative and false narratives to really flourish and thrive. And there's a demand for them. So on the one hand, we have this information environment that is really well suited to spreading and producing these false narratives. And on the other hand, we have a society, a social and political infrastructure, and that's both at the institutional federal government level and all the way then down to the popular societal level. A kind of a bed in which these same narratives then can really catch fire. So a good example would be, or an analogy. You have a lit match. If you drop it into a bucket of water, it goes out. If you drop it into a bucket of gasoline, it explodes. So if we think of that lit match as our information environment, our societal foundation right now is sort of like that bucket of gasoline. And so those two factors together really give conspiracies and false narratives a lot of power.
Jennifer Rubin, let me ask you this. Is this a paradox that on the one hand, we have this multitude of sources of information, which again, initially when it began and cable television began and we began to have the internet and so on, was greeted as a wonderful thing because there are so many voices in our country that everybody would be able to be represented. On the other hand, we have polarization, which seems to divide people into just two camps, generally speaking, at least politically. And that does seem to carry on beyond politics. And we have essentially two competing groups somehow. Is that a paradox?
I don't know if it's a paradox, but I think it's an illustration of yet perhaps another driver, and that is really the assault on democracy, not only in this country, but worldwide. This decay of truth coincides with the rise of illiberal regimes and the popularization of authoritarian, nationalist, often racially or ethnically based politics. And in that ecosphere, it is extremely helpful to their cause to not only misinform, but to create an atmosphere in which facts don't matter, in which there is a general distrust of all information. And therefore, it's only the leader, only the strong man who you could trust to give you the real truth. And that's a phenomenon that we see around the world. It's a phenomenon we see in the suppression of free and independent media in Europe, in Asia, really every continent. If you really want to be depressed, you can read Freedom House's latest report on liberty, freedom around the world, which is going in the wrong direction. So I think the way in which this manifests itself is that you not only have, I think as Jennifer eloquently put it, the match, the fuel, but you have someone or some bodies who are inclined to throw the match. It is in their interest. There is a purposefulness that we can't ignore. And I would say in this regard that the social media companies bear a lot of responsibility. By now, most of us know that we are all victims of these dreaded algorithms in which the time online and the engagement is driven by anger, is driven by negative emotion, and it gets leveraged on top of somebody even more extreme. And pretty soon you have a system that is designed to increase polarization, designed to create conflict. And so rather than spawn this wonderful collaborative community of voices, you have an intentional effort for us to attack one another. And we saw how terribly distressful this is. After building this Frankenstein-like monster, suddenly the social media companies had a problem. What do we do about the big lie about the election? What do we do about misinformation about vaccines? Suddenly, on these vital issues, it becomes really important to distinguish fact from not fact. But the system they've created does not lend itself to that. And in fact, I think leads itself to elevate the loudest, angriest, most extreme voices out there.
Jennifer, Kavanagh, one of the things you talk about in your book is cognitive bias. What does that have to do with what we're hearing?
Well, I think cognitive bias is really the starting point for this phenomenon, but it's not something that's new. So, there are a lot of things that are related to truth decay and what Jennifer Rubin's talking about that are things that we've seen emerge over the past 20 or so years, like social media and the internet environment. Cognitive bias has been around forever, and that's just simply the characteristics of the way we as human beings process information. And we use heuristics to help us make decisions, to help us sift through large amounts of information quickly. And that's adaptive, and it makes sense. We don't necessarily always have time to go through all of the steps of making a decision or assessing a situation. And so examples of cognitive biases that are really relevant to truth decay are things like motivated reasoning. We like to be right. We seek out information that confirms what we already believe. That can be a challenge, though. On the one hand, that may be useful in some situations, but if we're searching online for something, that means that instead of searching objectively for both things that agree with us and that disprove our pre-existing beliefs, we're really only focusing in on those things that confirm what we believe, and then we're stopping with that. The online environment is really well suited to feeding that need, that desire to be right, because no matter what you believe, you can probably find somebody out there who agrees with you and has written about it. Other things that feed into this phenomenon are things like recency bias. We tend to more heavily weight things that we heard more recently. Things that we heard more frequently, similarly, are more heavily weighted. We are influenced more strongly by our friends and family and anecdotes that have emotional resonance than we are by facts and data that are just presented on a page, even though facts and data that are drawn from potentially large and thousands of different observations are much more generalizable than a handful of anecdotes. Those anecdotes, what our friends and family tell us, can still have much stronger power over our decision-making and our beliefs. So these types of cognitive biases, while on the one hand, they serve in a kind of evolutionary purpose, on the other, they tend to lead us astray very often. And they make us prone to falling prey to false information and conspiracies, and then to cling on to that false information once we believe it. And I think that's the really important thing, is that once that belief becomes lodged, it's very difficult to change somebody's mind if they believe something kind of, with any sort of strength. And so those cognitive biases create the starting point. And then the way social media is set up, as Jennifer Rubin was talking about, really play into that. They kind of prey on those cognitive biases and exacerbate the effect of those biases on the way that we process information and the way that we make decisions.
And as you pointed out, the algorithms do the job because they go back again and again and again to what you were interested in before, only perhaps in an even more emotional and anger-producing way. But Jennifer, let me ask you this: with regard to the politics of it, you talked about the need for a strongman, or not the need for a strongman, but the fact that there is this tendency around the world for illiberal regimes to be led by strong men who become the authority, whatever it is that they say. How do you explain QAnon? And nobody knows who QAnon comes from.
Yeah. This is exactly one of these conspiracy theories that is emblematic of what we're going on now, but it's also emblematic of something America has always had. And Americans have always been prone to conspiracy theories. Yeah. It's a telltale sign of democracies, and particularly the American brand of democracy, of which there are lots of historical and sociological reasons. So you start with a pool of people who are perhaps more predisposed to conspiracies than anything else. And, this is one of these conspiracies which illustrates that you cannot disprove them. There is no set of facts that you or I or Jennifer can come up with that would disprove this notion that there's this individual that is somehow running the show or part of the secret state, because whatever example you give is just part of the plot. It's part of the conspiracy. How clever they are that they've now captured they would say even Bill Barr or even Mike Pence, if you're talking about some terrible thing that they think has befallen the former president. So I think it's, pinpointing why something sticks rather than something else is interesting. But in this case, again, as I've argued, it served a utilitarian value for a certain segment of our electorate. How do you maintain a sense of victimhood? How do you maintain a sense of, the society has done me wrong if your side is in control of the government? And the answer is they're really not in charge of the government. There's this mysterious other force that's in charge of the government. So often these conspiracies are linked to a utilitarian purpose that is helpful for one or another political party or religious group or ethnic group, and that they serve their ends. So it's not simply by coincidence that we have a theory that is going to somehow explain why it was that when you had one party that had Congress and the White House, that things were still not going according to plan. That may seem ridiculous to you and I and our audience when you hear the particulars, that there's some kind of pedophile, ring that's being run by Hillary Clinton. It sounds absolutely nuts, and it is. But once you have gotten in that frame, as Jennifer was saying, it's very hard to break out. It really is kind of a cult-like phenomenon in which there's no way to disprove a conspiracy that is that firmly held.
So, Jennifer Kavanagh, you talk in the book about the diminishing role of fact and analysis. It would seem to me this is an issue of analysis, because the facts that are produced by, or whatever it is that alleged facts that are produced by Synanon, if you subject them to what would be normal analysis, it would seem to me, they don't make any sense at all. Nobody could possibly believe that if they had a rational, reasonable approach to things. So how do you explain QAnon? What are we doing with this?
Well, there are a number of reasons why people cling on to conspiracies. One is that they use them to help explain the world. And that's why I think we've seen a real surge in conspiracy theory thinking in the context of the pandemic, because there's so much uncertainty and people are feeling afraid and unmoored and isolated. And so they cling to sort of anything that allows them to help explain the world. So even though something like QAnon seems not to make sense from the outside, there are attempts then to take all these disparate events that are upsetting and weave them into a narrative. And so for people who are on the inside, that can be comforting, because everything seems to fit together and they believe that there's this endpoint at which they will get some desired goal. But conspiracy theories serve a much broader purpose as well that is really entirely separate from the substance of the beliefs. And that has to do with this sense of identity and belonging, also something that people cling to in times of uncertainty. So being a part of this conspiracy, feeling like you're on the inside, like you have this family, like a tribe, who also believes this, that can be an incredibly comforting thing, and something that people may not want to give up, because if you give up the beliefs, you have to give up the belonging, and you have to give up that whole piece of your identity, which is wrapped up around being a follower of this set of principles. And so that is part of the reason why the actual substance of the beliefs may be secondary, and why even when you subject them to analysis, even when you present contradictory facts, and I think QAnon is a good example, because there's all these points at which certain things are supposed to happen according to the QAnon philosophy or principles, and those things haven't happened, and yet the narrative just keeps changing, right? So anybody who subjected that set of that timeline to any kind of analysis would find that there are holes, and that maybe this wasn't actually happening the way it was supposed to. But that analysis is sort of unimportant, and people are willing to explain it away or push it aside or not look at that carefully, because they're getting all of these other psychological and emotional value or benefits from being a part of this group or this cult.
You mentioned that there's not a lot new about a lot of this, and certainly a lot of people have been waiting around for the end of the world on a certain day. And when it doesn't happen on that certain day, they still manage to believe that, well, it must be some other day, and they begin to focus on that. But Jennifer Rubin, why do you think it is that the traditional institutions of authority in the United States have collapsed to such an extent in people's estimation that they're no longer to give them any credence at all? There used to be things we could rely on, like science, for example.
Well, this is, again, not an American phenomenon, but a phenomenon of the West. And there are lots of explanations for it. In the American context, you can point to government scandals, you can point to the Vietnam War, which bred a sense that we're being lied to, not just occasionally, but in everything, about everything, by everyone. You had really some economic failures, which led people to believe that you couldn't believe those experts, those economists, you couldn't believe business, you couldn't believe other institutions. And so I think some serial failures in the West tended to breed these and to create more than a cynicism, almost a nihilism that, nothing matters, who can say what's true, they're all out to get me. And I think in that sense, going back to something that Jennifer Kavanagh said, one of the things a conspiracy theory does is it gives you power, or it gives the illusion of power. I know what's going on. I'm the one who possesses this special knowledge. And therefore, I'm not some helpless person. I'm not adrift in a complex global society. I'm really in control, and I have more power than you do because I figured out the clue to this, grand conspiracy. And so I think you really had a collision of all of these factors, and there have been innumerable books written about them. And we should also be aware that these things also have kind of a cyclical history throughout American history. We've gone through periods of time when trust in government was very high, when there was an emphasis on communal action, when the two political parties weren't that far apart. When in Alex de Tocqueville's vision, there was a lot of communal activity. And now we're in a period of time in which it's a zero-sum game. If you get something, I lose something. And it's a very tense, I think, political, social climate where people think that they're always about to lose something. And that is a situation that's rife for a demagogue to come along and say, you're right, they're trying to take something from you, they're trying to cheat you, only I will be on your side. And you really can't believe anything you hear from anybody else. I will give you this sense of power, of belonging, of purpose. And I think we get to a very bad place, which is that I think skepticism is a good thing when dealing with power, but cynicism and, more importantly, nihilism is not. At some point, we have to be able to check with some semblance of objective reality in order to solve our problems. We cannot solve the COVID problem if everyone believes that COVID is just a myth made up by, elites that are trying to, manipulate us. In order to solve problems, in order to frankly survive, we have to reassociate reality with people's belief system. And that's, I think, why it's sort of come to a head now when you see that how fragile our democracy is, our health is, our economy is. And so it's very easy in these situations to imagine someone taking advantage of the situation and kind of pushing the whole thing down in order to capitalize on chaos, on distrust, on cynicism. And that makes for a very fraught environment, politically, socially, culturally, for many, many Americans.
Jennifer Kavanagh, in your book, to go back to it again, you talk about causes, which we've discussed to some extent, cognitive bias and other things. You talk about agents, whether they're political figures or Russians from abroad or whatever they might be. We've talked about consequences, including the polarization that's going on. You also say you want to find a road to solutions. What kind of road to solutions have you found?
Well, that's obviously the toughest question, is trying to figure out what to do about it, because it is such a tricky problem, and it's a systemic problem in the sense that it's now woven into sort of every aspect of our society, our relationships with each other, our relationships with our institutions, the way the institutions function. And so I think when we think about solutions, we're focusing on focusing on it from kind of a couple angles. There's going to have to be multiple solutions. It's a multifaceted problem. We're going to have to attack it from many angles. So the first is to think about this as a demand side problem. One of the major challenges we face is that when people go online, they don't always have the skills and the resources that they need in order to navigate this complicated and diverse and quickly changing online environment, and identify what's a fact and what's not, to sift through different types of information, to identify low quality sources, to read something and understand the bias or the perspective of the author, to identify things that are written with advocacy or emotion or anger in mind. So providing education, media literacy education, civics education, science education, statistics, these are the types of things that can help people have the skills and the tools they need when they go online, to read through articles about COVID or vaccines and understand what they're reading, to have the types of civic knowledge that you need to understand what the government is supposed to do, to evaluate claims about election integrity, to understand the purpose of democracy, the fact that in theory in a democracy we want more people to vote, to understand kind of what that means. To understand the role of the media, and statistics, to be able to understand polling. There's so much data on polls. How can you read that if you don't have a basic knowledge of statistics? So these are all things that we can provide to students. And then we also have to figure out how to reach adults. There's a lot of energy around providing especially media literacy and civics education in K-12 schools, but that only reaches a small portion of the population. Adults similarly struggle with these same things. And so I think a growth area, an area we really need to focus on, is how we reach adult populations who aren't necessarily the ones who would opt in to the resources that exist.
Jennifer,
also-
back to your
Mhm.
column of today, which I found really interesting about the Jim Crow legislation around the various places. You talked about the idea of there being a boycott against against Atlanta and against Georgia in general because of its involvement in the new laws, Jim Crow laws. And then you suggested, well, wait a minute, the boycott is going to hurt the people that aren't responsible for this issue. So one of the things you talked about was shaming. And I'm very interested in the idea of shaming because that does imply a kind of authority that people might call on or might respond to if there is, in fact, truth decay going on.
What a great question. I think there are a few things happening. First of all, just on the minor point of a boycott, unfortunately, we have so many voter suppression activities in over 40 states now that you can't boycott all of them. There'd be no place to go. So there's some practical problems when a problem gets to be of that magnitude. I think when you look at the larger picture, there are instances in which a agreed upon system of rules, of morality, of right and wrong, of object reality still has a little bit of a foothold there. You're not going to shame our former president, but you can shame some big corporations because they depend upon the goodwill, the reputation, their national presentation of a brand, which increasingly in our era, people select brands based upon intangible issues. Do I think this is a good company? Do I like this company? Is this company behaving in a respectful, responsible way? And what happened this week is that under a lot of pressure, executives of two very big companies, Coca-Cola and Delta, which couldn't manage to criticize the law when it was going through the state legislature. In fact, one of them, Delta, sort of praised it for getting better, suddenly had a epiphany. And the epiphany, of course, coincided with a lot of people talking about boycotts, but also a public letter by 72 African-American executives. And that shows, I think, the power that you can still have in not only shaming, but developing resources and figures that still have resonance. One of the things Jennifer mentioned was that people close to home tend to have you place a higher trust in them than people who are distant, regardless, frankly, of whether they actually have expertise or not. It's your mom, it's the guy down the street, it's your neighbor. You tend to trust those people who are in your milieu because you've built up a history of social trust with that person. Well, in this case, who better than to move the CEOs off the dime than a whole lot of publicly enraged and forthright African-American senior executives of big companies who said, no, this is not the right way to behave. You can't behave in this manner. And I think that had particular relevance because for that group of decision makers, that group of people, this group still carried the weight of authority, as you put it. And I think that's why when you're looking at how to unravel some of these conspiracies, attacks on the truth, we keep coming back to finding the right people to communicate to their community. So I think there's been a lot of discussion. Who are the best people to break down resistance to immunity? Turns out the best solution may not be putting a bunch of ads up in television, which everybody has learned to ignore and distrust, but it's having people in your community, your doctor, your pharmacist, the health clinic down the street. So I think part of the effort to right this ship is to find and elevate those voices who are perceived as trustworthy, and who actually do have a grasp on reality and can bring about some cohesion and some intellectual and moral clarity. That is not easy. And depending upon the problem, those people may look very different. I will share one political note to illustrate this. During the 2020 election, a group of those of us who would call ourselves never Trumpers, people who had in essence defected from the Republican Party, decided to do an ad campaign trying to convince like-minded people not to vote for the former president. They thought, well, maybe we could get a bunch of celebrities, a bunch of governors, all kinds of things. Turned out the most effective thing was ordinary Republicans who were shooting on their phones or on their screens, completely unscripted. They looked and sounded just like your neighbor, just like an ordinary person. So sometimes expertise can be alienating. Having a Republican governor get up there on a 30-second ad and said, here's all the reasons you shouldn't vote for this guy, is way less effective than having a guy who looks like your neighbor in this poorly shot, kind of shaky video, explaining his own revelations. And finding those sorts of credible messengers is a lot, I think, of the challenge that we're going to face.
That's really a fascinating answer. And we have come to the time when I would love to go on with this for hours, but it is time to give the audience a chance. They certainly deserve it, and they have come up with some interesting questions. And Jennifer Kavanagh, let me put this one to you. Jeffrey asks, and it really is quite relevant to what we just heard, I think, can democracy survive in this environment of decaying truth and polarization? Did she just suggest a way that maybe it will, maybe it is surviving?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would consider it too early to declare the death of democracy quite yet. I mean, certainly there are worrying trends. Certainly there are worrying trends, and there are things to be concerned about. But I think if you look over the experience of the past year, one thing we've seen is a real, like a renewal of concern and focus around this topic of dis and misinformation and what we're going to do about it, a growing recognition of the real world consequences of having an information environment which is so polluted with false information, and of living in a society in which distrust is so high, and in which we often face a situation in which facts and analysis seem to be discarded. And we've seen the consequences in the context of COVID. We've seen the consequences in the context of the events around January 6th. And so those types of things, I think, really made the immediacy of the consequences much more real for a large swath of the population. Certainly not for everyone, but I don't think you could expect everyone to kind of have the same experience. So I think that's certainly one reason for hope, is kind of this renewal, this focus around this issue. And I agree with Jennifer Rubin's focus here on strategic messaging and thinking about who are the right individuals to provide these messages. I think a really good example in the context of COVID is thinking about the way that in Washington, D.C., they're using churches and other religious institutions to actually provide vaccines. So not just to provide information to combat vaccine hesitancy, but you can actually get vaccines in churches in a lot of the poor areas of the city. And so that is a really good example of a way of identifying who has trust and using them to help kind of rebuild trust from the bottom up. And I really think that that's sort of where the focus has to be, is rebuilding trust from at the community level, at the local community level, and then gradually kind of building that up to the state and federal level.
So you focus on those authorities that have survived so far and still maintain some kind of credibility with large numbers of people. Jennifer Rubin, Richard asks this one, and this is a fun one, I think, for those of us in the media. How do you convince unsophisticated folks that, for example, CNN is more accurate than Fox? And I would throw in MSNBC to that one too, because if you watch MSNBC, it looks pretty much like it is a an arm of the Biden administration at the moment. They don't do a lot of criticism of the new president or his ideas.
Right. Well, I think there are degrees of misleading, unfortunately, and I think Fox kind of takes the cake.
I'm not accusing MSNBC of
I understand, and we've disclosed that I'm an MSNBC contributor.
I'm aware of it. Yeah.
So I think there is a difference about between a political bias where the glass is always half full, everything's going great, and another network which is trying to create conspiracy theories or trying to peddle in conspiracy theories, who puts guests online and puts hosts online who are going to make up a conspiracy about a young man who was killed and had to pay a pretty steep price. One of those networks, Fox, is now being sued royally by a couple big companies who are accused of manipulating the election returns as part of the big lie. So I think there are degrees of culpability here. How do you tell? Well, one thing you have to do is, I think you have to impress upon people that no one should be getting their news from one source or from one perspective. It takes a lot of work, I get that, but encouraging people to kind of check their facts or check around, or to look at those institutions that have a tradition of accuracy and have a structure that promotes fact checking, that requires retractions when they get it wrong, that has editors who are there to catch mistakes and catch errors, who, when they are defrauded by someone, will reveal the imposter. Maybe it's a storyteller, maybe it's a writer who's decided to come up with some bizarre story and has gotten himself onto the pages of one of the networks. So I think you can look, first of all, for people who have a track record. Secondly, for people who you see are institutionally devoted to correcting themselves. That's always, I think, a good sign. And I think, frankly, we should just be gosh darn critical and skeptical and cynical about anything that you're seeing on Facebook. How many times have you heard from somebody saying something ridiculous? I saw on Facebook, I saw on Twitter. Twitter doesn't generate them. It is and nor does Facebook. It is a reservoir of unformed, unchecked opinion and discussion. So I think getting people to perhaps return to more traditional sorts of media, to check themselves and to interact, and to also check with their lived experience. One of the more dangerous things about totalitarians and about non-democratic movements is they ask you not to believe your lying eyes, but believe what you are hearing. So if you see that there are millions and millions of people who are getting the COVID vaccination and they're not dying, and you do know that there are over 500,000 Americans who have passed away. Believe your eyes, use some common sense, use your lived experience to check these. And if something seems a little too pat, a little too weird, it's always worth double checking. And I think it does put the onus on the reader, the listener, the viewer. But I think we all have to be engaged media consumers now. It's the only way I think we are going to survive as a democracy.
So Jennifer Kavanagh, Richard has a really interesting question, which is this. If there are standards, such as Jennifer Rubin suggests, are there effective programs for teaching critical analysis in elementary or secondary schools? Kids obviously are growing up in this crazy milieu that we're talking about. They are exposed to it all the time. Are there effective, systematic ways of educating them to the ideas that I think all of us on this program espouse?
Yeah, well, there are actually a lot of curricula that exist to try to get at some of the things and to teach some of the skills and the critical thinking techniques that Jennifer Rubin mentioned. So there, as I said, there's been a lot of energy in this space for the past 5 years, and so there's a lot of curricula, and a growing number of schools are using them, and a growing number of states are, if not setting up standards or requirements, at least encouraging schools to integrate these types of curricula into their broader educational portfolio. There are a number of caveats to that, though. The first is that teachers, according to some RAND research that we did, teachers still feel like they lack the resources that they need to actually find these types of materials, and then to integrate them into their year-long curriculum. And part of that has to do with time and resources. They face an increasing number of demands, especially focused on math and reading. And it can be hard then to add something additional into the school day, especially over the past year where we've been doing virtual schooling. So there is still a gap between the resources that teachers have and what they feel they need to teach us effectively. Teachers themselves may not always feel like they have the skills to be teaching this. They may need some kind of training. If they don't feel comfortable in this online space, they may not have received education in this area. So that's another gap. And then the final challenge here is that we don't really have the set of robust evaluative data and evidence that we would like to have to understand what types of media literacy curricula work best. So we have some initial evidence that students who complete these types of curricula are better able to navigate an online space, to identify fact versus opinion, to make smarter choices about which news sources they trust. But we don't have really good randomized control trial or overtime analysis to understand what types, what teaching methods, what types of materials provide the biggest benefits and how long those benefits endure after the students receive them. So that's an area where RAND and a number of other organizations are really trying to beef up and build up this evaluative research base that we can then use to help teachers make choices between curricula and help them to develop, if necessary, new curricula that really highlight and leverage the lessons from that research base.
Jennifer Rubin, Ava has an interesting question, and just let me supply some background. It used to be that the Communications Act required equal time and required what was referred to as the fairness doctrine. Ava wants to know, is there any way that the Communication Act could be amended now to allow regulation of social media that would alleviate some of the problems we're talking about?
Boy, is that a good question. That is a very, very hot topic right now. Yeah. When the internet was in its infancy, there came up on a provision in the Federal Communication Code that essentially said the internet doesn't have to take on the responsibility of a publisher. If the Washington Post publishes something that is defamatory or publishes something it knows to be false, it can be sued. It can be held civilly liable. Not so with Twitter or with Facebook or other social media platforms. They, in essence, got a dispensation because they wanted to include all these different voices. They didn't want to strangle the baby in the crib, all of these explanations. And as a result, they put up information with impunity and allow people to put up information with impunity that a publisher, and I don't mean necessarily a newspaper, a publisher could be any speaker, any source of information, could not get away with because he or she might be held civilly responsible. So I think one of the things, and I think this goes to Jennifer's point about how we kind of begin to think about this and fix this, is increasing accountability and increasing transparency. One of the things we don't know, the average person doesn't know, is that they're being manipulated when they go on social media by these algorithms. One possible solution that's been suggested is if they're going to continue to have this exemption, if you will, from civil liability in many instances, then they have to disclose really what their algorithms are doing and how they work and how you are being, how your attention is being drawn to other like-minded people or even radical people. So one concern is that a lot of the disinformation, misinformation, bad sources of information tend to pop up where there's no accountability and no transparency. And so if you think about using both of those, they will tend to help people, encourage people to clean up their act. We mentioned a little while ago that Fox is being sued by two enormous technology companies who were involved in the production of the software and the hardware that was used to run our election. They're being sued for billions of dollars. We don't know whether they're going to prevail or not, but say they do prevail. That acts as a powerful deterrent to start behaving in ways that more traditional media does, with attention to fact checking, with attention to editorial control. And that sort of thing does prompt people to think twice before they put some loony theory on the airwaves. I think we are in for a period of time now, and I know many people who are involved with this organization and many listeners have been involved with efforts for social media to regulate hate speech, to take down hate speech. They all have policies that say we won't tolerate all this stuff, and yet their social media platforms are filled with it, whether it's anti-Semitism, anti-Asian prejudice, white supremacists, whatever it is. And holding companies accountable for policing themselves, even if they're not held responsible for the content of that hate speech, is critical. And groups like the Anti-Defamation League have been somewhat successful in trying to enlist major companies, advertisers, to try to exert some leverage. It's difficult because, as we all know, these social media companies have gotten to be very, very powerful. And in some sense, they're immune to a lot of the normal pressures corporations would face. But I think if people continue to think of these two important principles, accountability and transparency, I think we'll be moving in the right direction. I do want to say as well that leadership matters. We've gone from a administration in which facts were not valued, to put it mildly, or misinformation was dispensed, to a administration which, I'll give one example, has 3-day-a-week briefings on COVID with non-political figures, with Dr. Fauci, Dr. Walensky, other experts. And what they're doing, I believe, is trying to recalibrate our expectations and our information, that you can trust these people. We're going to give you critical information. We're going to be honest with you when we've screwed up. Now, we have to evaluate whether they're making good on that promise, but at least they are offering impartial expert scientists to speak directly to the public without the filter of a crazy person and highly ideological political players. Okay. So leadership does matter.
Jennifer Kavanagh, we're pretty close to being out of time. Is there anything you'd like to add to all of what we have heard so far? Anything you'd like to suggest?
Well, I think that in this conversation, we've covered the kind of the key points in terms of thinking about the solution space, which I think is really where we want to be focusing. We can spend a lot of time admiring the problem, but really focusing on solutions is where I think we should be. And so we've talked about education. We've talked about the value of communicating complicated technical research findings in a way and through people that resonate with the average individual, which I think is something that both journalists like Jennifer and researchers like me have to think about as well in terms of how we communicate kind of what we're trying to say. We've talked about the importance of trying to reduce the vulnerability of online spaces, especially social media platforms. platforms to harmful and dangerous disinformation. And then we talked about the importance of trust and how we can rebuild trust. This idea of transparency, as Jennifer was just talking about, the frequent briefings from renowned experts in their field. This gets to a concept that Michael Rich, my co-author on the Truth Decay book, and I wrote about in December on civic infrastructure and the role of transparency and expertise of providing data and evidence and helping people to kind of see behind the curtain of how policy decisions are made and making sure that those decisions are evidence-based. And that can go a long way to start to rebuild this trust and these kind of ties between individuals and between individuals, institutions, which can be really the foundation for then helping to overcome some of these challenges that we've talked about.
Well, we are in fact out of time, and Jennifer Rubin, I'm sorry I can't give you the same opportunity that I just gave Jennifer Kavanagh, but I would say that programs like this, and thanks to American Crossroads for airing this, are, it seems to me, one of the ways that we can begin to penetrate the issues that Truth Decay raises and is going to raise for some time to come. So Jennifer Kavanagh and Jennifer Rubin, thank you both very much for being with us. And I wish we could go longer. I just want to, let me notify our listeners and viewers that the next version of America at a Crossroads is Tuesday, not Wednesday, but Tuesday, April 6th. And Doris Kearns Goodwin is going to be on that program. I hardly think it's necessary to explain who she is, one of the major historians that we have with us today. Pat Morrison, a great friend of mine, is going to be the interlocutor for that program. So don't forget about that. Stay in good health, wear your masks, and have a good evening. Thanks to you all very much for being with us.